Hey there and welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 83. And today we're going to be talking about something that I think needs to be said a lot more often. And that is why talking therapy on its own is never enough. Now, before you start typing out an angry email to me because you have a favourite counsellor that really helped you, let me be clear about something. Talking therapy in the right hands can be genuinely useful, right? I'm not here to trash an entire profession, and I'm not saying don't go, but there's no getting away from the fact that it falls short for so many people. And by the end of this episode, I want to get across why I think that is and what you can do about it. So grab a cuppa or whatever you do when you're listening to your podcasts, and let's get started. Hey there and welcome to the Inner Shift podcast. My name is Stephen Burns and I've been a practicing therapist, coach and trainer for nearly 30 years. In each episode, I'll share tips, strategies and insights that you can put into practice straight away to create positive, lasting change in your life. We'll be discussing topics like NLP, mindfulness, positive psychology, hypnosis and the power of the subconscious mind. So if you have things that are standing in the way of your happiness and well-being, or if you're just invested in your own personal development, my friend, you are absolutely in the right place. So I was talking to a friend the other day. She has quite a lot of anxiety and she told me that she had recently been to see a CBT therapist. So she went down the traditional route of going to see her GP or doctor. She waited about 6 months, I think, to get an appointment with a CBT counsellor. And she then went through a series of sessions. So I think it's 8 that you get on the NHS in the UK. And I said to her, what did you think? Did you get a result from it? And she said that it was okay. It definitely did help. I mean, talking to someone is always going to be beneficial. But she never really felt that her problem changed that much at the core level. She could manage it a bit better, which of course is definitely a win, but the anxiety itself was still kind of there, bubbling away in the background. One of the things she also said was that she had a much better understanding as to why she was feeling the way that she was, and that was quite cathartic in the short term. But again, the core aspects of the problem for her still remained. And this is a story I've heard a lot. For many people, talking therapy is okay. Some people it can be profound, of course, but so many people say that it's just lacking something. It doesn't seem to go deep enough. So in this episode, I want to go through a few different reasons why I think this can happen. Before we do though, I want to just very quickly mention something that is up and coming. So in September, starting on September the 14th, I'm going to be running a live self-hypnosis bootcamp. So it's all going to be done on Zoom. It's going to be 6 sessions. There's going to be a ton of resources, MP3s, exercises that you can have a play about with. You'll have the opportunity, of course, to ask questions throughout the live sessions too. I'm going to be digging into self-hypnosis and showing you a powerful model you can use to create long-lasting change. If you want to check that out, there is a podcast exclusive discount. You'll find full details of that in the show notes. One thing I do want to say is that there are only 7 places left on the bootcamp. I already have 23 people that have booked. So if you do want to grab your place, I recommend you don't hang about for too long before doing it. Okay, so let's dig in. So the first reason why I believe that talking therapy is never enough to create long-lasting change is because understanding your problem isn't the same thing as change. So most talking therapies work from the same basic model. You talk through your problem, you dig into where it came from, you analyse it, and then once you fully understand it cognitively, the hope is that this then allows you to get some kind of conscious insight that leads to the change, which is fine. Sometimes that definitely is enough, but a lot of the time it's not, because most of your problems and hang-ups don't live in your conscious mind. They go much deeper than that. They live in your subconscious mind. They are patterns that you've learned, most likely over a long period of time, that have become automatic. So trying to consciously lever yourself out of these issues can feel like you're trying to climb up a hill with a huge heavy ball and chain attached to your back. It feels like you're fighting against something much more powerful than your own willpower. And I think this is especially relevant with things like anxiety, low confidence, low self-esteem, sadness, depression and anger. These are all feelings, but they're also belief systems that we've created and bought into over time. And trying to talk yourself out of these, or to try to create change analytically, cognitively, especially with feelings, is very, very difficult. Now, one thing that can be useful is analysing and understanding your beliefs, the limiting beliefs that are causing the problem. So you do this in CBT. I think it's one of the best parts of CBT. And we also do this a lot in NLP. This is very useful, but it is just a starting point. Understanding your beliefs is not the same thing as changing them. And with a lot of talking therapies, they're often very heavy on the understanding, but very light on the actual change part, which I think is a real downside. And I think that's why often people finish a series of CBT or counselling sessions and they understand why they're messed up. They could probably write an essay on it, but they don't feel much different, because understanding doesn't automatically lead to transformation. So that's the first reason. The second reason, and this is something I've already touched on, but I'd like to add to it, is that you're often fighting against much more powerful parts of your mind than your conscious willpower. So there's an analogy I like to use for this because I think it sums it up really well. Trying to create change using purely conscious efforts, willpower, and cognitive insight, while your subconscious patterns haven't yet been addressed, is a bit like trying to accelerate your car with the handbrake on. You might manage to travel a few feet, but it's going to feel like hard work. You're going to be burning fuel, grinding the gears, and pretty much getting nowhere fast. And you're going to be exhausted and most likely demoralised by the end of it. So I think that's what it can be like trying to think your way out of a subconscious pattern. Your subconscious mind is running the vast majority of what you do, your habits, your feelings, what you react to, what you believe. And it's incredibly good at doing its job. It's been running those patterns most likely for years, maybe even longer. It's a well-oiled machine. So trying to strong-arm it into a change through conscious effort and willpower alone just isn't going to cut it. Not because you're not trying hard enough, but because you're just using the wrong tool for the job. And I think that's why I love things like self-hypnosis. It approaches change in a very different way. Rather than trying to create change from the top down, trying to convince yourself through logic and cognitive insight to change, you're using creativity and imagination to speak directly to the parts of you that are responsible for the problem so that you can rewire them. So that's reason number 2. The third reason why talking therapy is often not enough is because talking about a problem, especially when done excessively, can actually reinforce it rather than change it. So there's a big push at the moment in mental health to talk about your problems. And the reason why is because people often hide them. They maybe feel ashamed or embarrassed to talk about them, so they ignore them, they just push them away, and then eventually they can get worse, they escalate, and perhaps they'll reach some kind of breaking point. So people, over the last 10 years or so, people are being strongly encouraged to talk about the problems so they don't bottle things up. And this also helps remove the stigma around mental health, which is great. I think that's a fantastic thing. When I was growing up, there was a huge stigma, and especially if you're a man, you just did not talk about these things. And that is not healthy. So talking about your problems is good. I think that's a great step, and we've made massive strides in that regards. But it's important to remember that anytime you talk about a problem, you're actually reliving it in your experience. You're driving yourself into the state that's caused by it. So, for example, say you have an issue with anxiety and you talk about it with a friend or a therapist or someone else. You'll most likely start to feel anxious as you talk about it because you're driving yourself into the state. You're reminding yourself of the problem. Or anger. If you're talking about an anger issue that you've been experiencing, you'll most likely get angry as you're explaining it. So if you talk excessively about an issue, especially over a series of sessions, then you can end up inadvertently feeling worse. You can end up reinforcing it because whatever you practice, you reinforce. You're strengthening the neural pathways. So you're maybe wondering, how do you get round this? Because clearly you need some kind of explanation. You can't just walk into a therapy session and say nothing and hope that they figure it out. You still have to talk about it, but it's important to realise that too much is not necessarily good. There will be a point where it becomes unproductive, and potentially it could end up taking you in the wrong direction. So the key is to talk about it enough until you, as the therapist or coach, understand the structure of the problem. What are the key underlying patterns and structures that are holding it in place? So for me, when I work with a client, I tend to look for 5 things. The first is feelings and emotions, problematic feelings that are getting in the way. They might be things like anxiety, sadness, low confidence, things like that. Second thing I look for is beliefs. So what are the underlying ideas that the person has bought into that are actually causing the feelings in the first place? What connections your mind has made that's keeping the problem intact? And when did you make that connection? Also, I'm interested in what habits and behaviours have formed as a result of that. Once I've got that information, and usually I can get that from an initial consultation, the first 30 minutes, that is enough. It's time to move on and start to work on the change. You might revisit that every now and again because sometimes additional layers can present themselves, but you don't want to be talking about the issue to death, until the person's just feeling so bad that, because you've relived the problem over and over again. You're looking to talk strategically. You want to figure out the key underlying patterns and structures that are holding the problem in place. That's certainly how I tend to approach it, and I find it's very, very effective. What I'm not interested in is the story, the theory of what the problem is. Now, I listen to the story from a human perspective. I don't want to come across as callous. I use it to create rapport. But it's not that important when it comes to creating change. In fact, it can often just get in the road. So instead, I'm looking for what are the underlying structures of the problem, what's holding it in place, the things I just mentioned a moment ago. So the reason this is relevant to talking therapies is because they have a tendency to get far too wrapped up in the story, and you end up talking in circles, reinforcing the issues, or potentially even adding extra layers to it through suggestion because you're talking about it over and over again. Also, as an additional point, I think there's a fine line between explaining your problems and trauma dumping. And if you go in too heavy with the idea that you need to always be talking about your problems to excess, then people will use that as a way to trauma dump, which will give them temporary relief for sure, but it's not useful for long-term change because they're just digging themselves deeper and deeper into the issue. So that's the third reason, and the fourth and final reason I want to cover is that talking therapy has a tendency to use labels and personality typing way too much. So this is where you go for some therapy and you get diagnosed as having abandonment issues, or you find out that you have anxious attachment or avoidance attachment, or you're an individualist or a type C personality, or maybe there's a problem with your internal family systems. Maybe your inner child is playing up and needs a good talking to. Or maybe all of that is just taking you further and further away from what you're actually responding to. So personally, I think these things are very interesting from an intellectual perspective, these concepts, and they can be a useful entry point. So for example, a lot of therapists use what's called a schema approach, and they use these personality types as a way to kind of like just get into the aspects that need to be addressed, that need to be focused on. But they do come with some pretty big downsides. What often happens is the client sees this as a diagnosis and they often self-identify with it. We tend to do this as human beings. Some people absolutely love a label and they love to identify with it. So you actually end up reinforcing the problems at the level of identity. In fact, you're actually most likely making it worse because the person starts to believe that this problem is their personality. And when we believe something is part of our personality, it becomes almost impossible to change. It becomes fixed. So that's a real big danger as soon as you start talking in terms of personality types and labels. And at the end of the day, these are just concepts. They've not been proven or anything like that. They're just ideas that we've created to understand our experience. Another reason why I don't like excessive labelling is the more labels you add onto something, the further you get away from what is actually happening in a person's subjective experience. Ultimately, when we have an issue, it's because at some point in our life, our brain has made a connection or a couple of connections, and those connections aren't helpful. This has then become stuck, and it's led to problematic feelings. Maybe there's also some destructive habits and behaviours that have been caused as a result. So to solve it, you need to figure out what that connection is and then rewire it. So I'll give you an example. Say you experienced generalized anxiety disorder. So that's the term used to describe someone who has anxiety pretty much every day. So say that was you, right? Almost always it's because at some stage in your life you'll have made a connection. Now it might be subconscious, the connection, you might not have been aware of it at the time, but you'll have made some kind of connection that's led you to believe that you're not safe, that you're under threat. So maybe you had a violent childhood, so you were always, walking on eggshells, and your brain made the connection that you had to constantly be alert, you had to constantly be aware because there was danger everywhere. Or maybe you were bullied quite a lot as a kid, and again your brain made that connection that you were under threat, and you had to be aware, you had to watch out. And that connection just stuck. And even though those events are long gone, they're in the past, you're still acting out of that connection now. And that's the way the brain works, unfortunately. We make connections that can stick with us. So what you need to do in order to move forward is you need to, first of all, figure out what that connection is. What was it that made you believe that you're not safe, that you're under threat? And then go back and reevaluate that connection and rewire it or rewrite it so that you're no longer living life through that lens. And what makes that difficult is the layers and layers of story and labels that have been piled on top, potentially over years. And talking therapy often adds to that. In fact, there's some types of talking therapy that cause it in the first place. They just pile these concepts and theories and ideas on top of a client, and it makes them feel like they've got answers, but they're actually further and further away from what's really going on. And again, this is another reason why I love self-hypnosis. It allows you to bypass the story, to bypass all of the descriptions, the theories, the labels, and go straight for the underlying connection and communicate to the part that's actually causing the problem right now and working with that. It cuts out all of that stuff that isn't really relevant. So that's why talking therapy is often never enough to create long-lasting change. I hope you don't think I've come across here like I know all the answers or that I'm trashing all types of talking therapy. I'm not. It can work for a lot of issues and it can work for many people, especially if the therapist is skilled. But I've heard this story so often where it really does fall short because it doesn't go deep enough. One thing I want to mention is a lot of CBT practitioners and counsellors and psychotherapists now use very much a multidisciplined approach. So they are using more modern approaches like hypnosis, they're infusing elements of NLP, which is fantastic. I think that's a great way to do it. But there are still many therapists and counsellors out there who don't, and I think they're genuinely missing a trick for themselves and also for their clients. So let's do a quick review before we finish this episode. So the first reason why talking therapy on its own is almost never enough is because understanding isn't the same as change. Many talking therapies, they are very heavy on the analysis side. They give you a good understanding about your problem, which is great, but they're kind of light on the actual change part, or they try to get you to change through cognitive conscious means. Number two, you're fighting against much more powerful parts of your own mind. If you're not addressing the subconscious patterns that are causing the problem in the first place, and you're just trying to change through conscious insights and willpower, then it is a bit like trying to drive with the handbrake on. It's going to be hard work and you're not really going to get anywhere. It's going to be super frustrating, potentially even demoralising. Number three, talking about a problem, especially when done excessively, can actually reinforce it rather than change it. Can also potentially add layers to it. Talking about a problem is great. I don't want to dissuade you from doing that, of course, but you want to talk about it strategically. There's a very specific way that you want to talk about it. Rather than just sharing layer and layer of story, you want to understand the key elements, the structure behind the problem. That's the thing that you need to know in order to then make a change, or that's certainly the thing a therapist needs to know. So you don't want to talk about it too much because that's going to drive you into the problem and it could end up reinforcing it or adding extra layers to it. And number four, talking therapy has a tendency to use far too many labels and personality typing. And these things are interesting. You know, I love reading about internal family systems. I think it's cool. But I think it's important for us to realise they don't actually exist. They are just concepts. They're just models that we use to understand our experience. And when you start piling on labels and personality types over and over again, theories and concepts, you're getting further and further away from what you're actually responding to. What is the connection that you made that's led to you feeling this way, that's led to these potentially destructive habits and behaviours? The more labels and theory and types that you add in, the further you're going to get away from what you're actually responding to. So that is us for this episode. If you enjoyed it, if you did get value from it, I would love it if you could follow, or even better, if you could leave a review. It really does help. So enjoy the rest of your week, whatever you're doing, and I'll speak to you in the next episode. Bye.